I never thought my own parents would look at me as if I were nothing more than a burden. Yet there I was, in a sterile hospital room on Christmas Eve, clutching my phone with trembling hands while my mother's voice pierced through the screen. "Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months." Her words echoed, bouncing off the pale walls until they felt like they were echoing inside my skull. My abdomen throbbed with pain, every wave sharp and twisting, as if some cruel hand were carving into me from the inside. The doctors had already explained the stakes. I had internal bleeding, and the surgery could not wait. But what hurt worse than the bleeding was the look of annoyance on my mother's face, pixelated yet unmistakable, as if my pain was just another inconvenience in her schedule. "My name is Natasha Wilson. I am 33 years old, a widow, and the mother of two beautiful twins, Ethan and Emily, just 2 years old." They sat in the corner of the hospital room, too young to understand, playing quietly with soft blocks, while a kind nurse named Valerie checked my vitals. My heart broke not just from the betrayal of my parents, but from the thought that if this surgery went wrong, my children might lose me too, after already losing their father to a drunk driver just 6 months ago. When I asked my parents, my own parents, for help, I thought maybe, just maybe, they would put aside their plans for one night. I had already exhausted every other option. But my father's response cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. "You're becoming a real nuisance, Natasha. A burden. We're retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems." The word burden rang in my ears like a cruel bell. I had been supporting them financially for years, sending $2,500 every month since they retired early. I had carried their mortgage on my back while raising twins, grieving my husband, and struggling to breathe through my own despair. I had done it because I believed families should take care of each other. And now, when I needed them most, they were telling me I was too much trouble. Tears blurred my vision, spilling onto the stiff hospital blanket. Valerie, sensing the storm inside me, gently squeezed my shoulder. "My friend Olivia is a nanny. She's worked with children in trauma. Let me call her for you." Her kindness was like a balm against the jagged wound my parents had torn open. "Yes," I whispered, my voice shaking but resolute. "Please call her." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that asking my parents for help had been like begging water from a dry well. There was nothing there. There never had been. As Valerie stepped out to make the call, memories washed over me in suffocating waves. My childhood had been defined by absence, by the constant shadow of my younger sister Jessica, the golden child who could do no wrong. When I graduated college with honors, my parents barely showed up. Jessica had landed a small commercial that same weekend, and all attention was on her. When I married James, they complained the venue was too far. When the twins were born, they visited once, then complained the babies cried too much. James had been my anchor through it all. He understood the ache of family betrayal. His own father had cut him off years earlier. "We'll build our own family," he always told me. "A real one that knows how to love." And for a while we did. Our home was filled with laughter, with warmth, with the steady kind of love that makes you believe the past can't touch you anymore. But then a drunk driver shattered it all, leaving me with two babies and a grief so heavy I could barely stand. Even then, I kept helping my parents. I increased the money when they claimed inflation was eating into their lifestyle. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I told myself love meant sacrifice. What a fool I was. By the time Valerie returned, my decision was made. Olivia arrived soon after, and she was everything I needed her to be: warm, calm, professional. Ethan reached for her hand almost instantly. Emily curled into her lap within minutes. Watching them, I felt something break loose inside me, a thread that had tethered me to my parents all my life, thin but unyielding. "Could you bring me my phone one more time?" I asked Valerie with trembling hands. And then, with the steadying weight of my children's future pressing down on me, I sent two messages. The first was to my bank: cancel all automatic transfers to my parents' account. The second was to my parents: I will no longer provide financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Don't contact me again. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, A strange calm settled over me. I was still afraid I could die in that surgery. My children could be left without both parents. But alongside the fear came something unexpected. For the first time in my life, I felt free. The surgery was successful, though it left me weaker than I imagined. 5 days blurred together in the white haze of the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, pain pressing down on me like an anchor. Olivia was there through it all, a quiet guardian for Ethan and Emily, staying with them in my hospital room during the day and taking them back to my apartment at night. She had stepped into the space my parents had abandoned, and she filled it with a love that wasn't bound by blood but by choice. When I was lucid enough to check my phone, I found 27 missed calls and dozens of text messages, all from my parents and Jessica. Not one of them asked how my surgery had gone. Not one asked if their grandchildren were safe. Instead, the messages were filled with anger, confusion, and desperate pleas about their mortgage payment. "You can't just cut us off like this," my father wrote. "We've already paid for our cruise next month and the tickets are non-refundable." It was surreal. I was lying in a hospital bed, staples in my abdomen, fighting my way back to life, and all they cared about was their vacation. Jessica's messages were different. "Mom and Dad just told me you had some minor procedure," she texted. "Why are they freaking out about money? What's really going on?" For the first time, it dawned on me that my parents had lied to her. They had told her I was exaggerating, being dramatic, that my surgery was routine, nothing serious. I felt the weight of their deception crash down on me, heavier than the IV lines tethered to my arms. Even now, even when my life had hung by a thread, they had chosen to manipulate the story for their own convenience. I typed back the truth, still groggy from medication. I told her about the emergency, about the internal bleeding, about how they refused to watch the twins because of a concert. Her reply came fast. "Oh my God, Natasha. I had no idea. I would have been there. I would have watched the twins. I'm so sorry I believed them." A lump formed in my throat. Jessica had never been cruel, only blinded by the constant favoritism and lies of our parents. Maybe now she would finally see them for who they truly were. By the time I was discharged, I had made decisions I never thought I would be strong enough to make. Olivia agreed to stay on part-time as a nanny to help with the twins while I healed. I contacted a lawyer to draft a will naming a trusted friend as the guardian for Ethan and Emily, should anything happen to me, certainly not my parents. And I blocked my parents' numbers, leaving only Jessica's line open. The financial reality was sobering. That $2,500 I had been sending them each month wasn't pocket change. It was nearly a third of my income as a freelance graphic designer. Without that weight dragging me down, I could afford Olivia's help and even start to rebuild the emergency fund that had been wiped clean after James's death. For the first time in years, my money was being used for my family. My real family. That first night, back in my apartment, I lay awake in my bed, listening to the soft breathing of the twins in the next room. Guilt nipped at me, sharp and insistent, the kind of guilt that comes from decades of conditioning. Was I wrong to cut my parents off? Was I being selfish? But then I remembered the cold indifference in my father's voice, the way my mother's eyes hardened when I begged for help. I remembered the word burden, and for once I allowed myself to answer that guilt with truth. No, I was not selfish. I was a mother protecting her children from people who had already proven they would never put us first. Days turned into weeks. My strength returned slowly, the incision aching each time I bent too quickly, but I was alive, and that was enough. Olivia arrived each morning to help with the twins, and her steady presence was a lifeline. My design clients were patient, giving me room to recover, and I worked in small bursts from home. Jessica visited twice, each time bringing meals and spending time with Ethan and Emily. Our conversations were hesitant at first, but one evening as we sat watching the twins build towers of blocks, she broke the silence. "They always made it seem like you were the one pulling away," she admitted softly. "I never realized they were the ones pushing you out." Something shifted in me then. For the first time, I saw my sister not as the golden child, but as another victim of our parents' manipulation. Maybe we weren't enemies after all. And then one night came the knock I had been half expecting, half dreading. When I peered through the peephole, my heart lurched. My parents stood there, my mother clutching her designer purse. My father's arms crossed, impatience etched into every line of his face. I hesitated, then opened the door just enough to speak. "What do you want?" My voice shook, but it was steadier than I felt. "Natasha, darling." "We've been so worried," my mother began, her tone syrupy, the kind she always used when she wanted something. "You haven't answered our calls. We needed to make sure you and the twins were all right." "We're fine," I replied flatly. "It's not just that," my father interrupted, pushing against the door. "We need to discuss this ridiculous financial situation. The bank called about our mortgage. We had to dip into our cruise savings to cover it." The audacity was breathtaking. No questions about my recovery, no concern for their grandchildren. Just demands, always demands. "I told you I'm cutting financial ties," I said, my voice sharpening. "And I meant it." My mother's eyes widened in mock hurt. "But sweetie, we've come to depend on that money. Your father and I adjusted our lifestyle based on your commitment to help us." "My commitment?" I repeated, disbelief rising like fire in my chest. "I sent money out of guilt, while you couldn't even watch your grandchildren during my emergency surgery." My father's face darkened. "That's not fair, Natasha. We had plans. Plans more important than my children's safety, more important than my life." I shot back, my voice trembling with fury. "Do you even know what the doctor said? There was a chance I might not survive? Did you even ask?" The silence that followed was answer enough. My mother's voice softened in that practiced way that used to make me doubt myself. She tilted her head, reaching for the tender place where guilt lives. "We made one mistake," she whispered, as if minimizing a wound could heal it. "Are you really going to punish us like this?" The word caught in my throat. Punish. How neatly it rewrote the reality of what they'd done. I stood there in the narrow doorway with the chain still latched and felt a quiet, anchored clarity rise inside me. "This isn't punishment," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "This is consequence. I asked for help so I could live to raise my children. You chose a concert." My father's mouth tightened, the old authority curling his spine. "We're your parents." He said it like a verdict, as if the title should be enough to erase what came before. "And I'm a parent too," I answered. "I will never treat Ethan and Emily the way you've treated me." The truth of that filled the doorway, a living thing that did not require their approval. A small gasp drifted up from the hallway carpet. Emily, clutching her stuffed giraffe, had wandered into view. My mother dropped the performance for another, her voice going bright and sugary. "There's my precious grandbaby," she cooed, bending as if the years could fold themselves back into a soft picture. Emily retreated behind my legs, uncertain, her fingers pressing crescents into my calf. The ache and the answer arrived together. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "When I'm ready to talk, if I'm ever ready, I'll reach out." My father started to protest, but I closed the door on the last syllable. The click of the latch sounded like a line being drawn at last. They returned the next morning with a chorus. Aunt Patty's voice floated through the wood, practiced and pleading, the peacemaker trying to script my lines for me. "Be reasonable. They're struggling." I stood with my palm on the door and remembered all the years I had mistaken managing other people's comfort for kindness. "They managed for decades before I helped," I said through the barrier. "They chose early retirement. They chose the boat. They chose the tickets." I walked away as their knocking softened into a weary rhythm, then stopped altogether. By afternoon, the story had been forwarded to a wider audience. My father's group email went out to the entire extended family, casting me as the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her parents in their hour of need. He left out the hospital room the word burden, the children too young to understand why Nana and Grandpa would not come. He wrote only the part that made them look small and me look monstrous. What he hadn't anticipated was the world outside his narrative. Replies began to stack like stones. A cousin asked about the new boat he'd bragged about last month. An aunt mentioned the diamond tennis bracelet shown off at Thanksgiving. Private messages pinged my phone like quiet hands on my back. "Is this true? What really happened?" Jessica called after reading every reply. She sounded exhausted, as if a long play had ended and the theater lights were too honest. "They told everyone you cut them off for no reason," she said. I didn't know about the surgery. I didn't know. I could hear it in her voice, the brittle thing inside her starting to crack, where the truth was finally getting in. Together, we drafted a single clean response and sent it to the thread, a few sentences, only facts, no fire. Emergency surgery, refusal to watch the twins, a focus on recovery, no further discussion. And then a quiet thing happened. Our family, messy and human, began to reorient toward the center, where the truth sat patient and unmoving. The support arrived in strange and tender shapes. My cousin's wife left soup on my doorstep with a note that said, "For the brave mother." A second cousin I barely knew offered to babysit once a week so I could rest. Valerie from the hospital texted an invitation to a Zoom group for young widowed parents. I joined from the dining table after the twins were asleep, camera on face bare. People with eyes like mine nodded when I spoke. Loss recognized loss. Resilience reached out a hand. I logged off lighter as if grief had made more room for breath. Meanwhile, my parents' crisis bloomed in the vacuum where their entitlement had lived. Jessica discovered a second mortgage taken to finance the boat and the timeshare, an unsteady pile of numbers balanced on the assumption that my deposits would arrive forever. Their messages turned frantic, the tone sliding from accusation to begging in a handful of days. "We never thought you'd actually stop. We can't do this without you." It was strange to realize their love had always had a ledger. They came again this time with a spreadsheet and a new performance, not the triumphant parents or the wounded ones, but supplicants with columns. "We need 144,000 to catch up," my father said, as if the number were a simple household item I might pull from a cupboard. I made tea and let the steam rise between us. "Sell the boat," I said. "Sell the timeshare." My mother frowned at the word loss, as if dignity were a currency she had never considered saving. "Those are our retirement luxuries," she murmured, and I heard the child inside her who had always been coddled by the next indulgence. "Luxuries you can't afford," I said gently. "Not with my name attached." Ethan wandered in, thumping his toy truck against the chair leg, and my parents' faces softened again, that quick pivot toward the easiest love. "They don't know you," I said, and the sentence hurt us all. "You've seen them 3 times." Silence pressed into the spaces between the clink of cups. My mother's eyes filled, whether with recognition or strategy, I could not tell. "Without your help, we'll lose everything," she whispered. I looked at the boy by my knee, the girl asleep down the hall, the 2 small galaxies my life orbited now. "I lost my husband," I said, my voice low and firm. "My children lost their father. We survived. You will too." When they left, the apartment felt quiet in a new way. Not the old brittle quiet of bracing for the next demand, but a soft, breathable silence. I rinsed the mugs and watched the tea leaves spin down the drain like small storms finally losing their power. Later, as the twins pressed warm and heavy into sleep, I sat in the dark and let my hands remember that steadiness is a practice. Boundaries are not a door you close once. They are a home you learn to live inside. A week later, a foreclosure notice found them. Jessica called with a voice that had learned at last the shape of consequence. "They have 60 days, she said. "They're panicking. They want me to ask you again." I stood at the window and watched the city turn itself gold. "Tell them I hope they choose differently this time," I said. "Tell them I'm choosing differently too." 3 months after my surgery, the inevitable finally came. My parents lost the house, the grand 4,000 square foot lakefront property that had been their pride for decades. Jessica kept me updated with short, strained phone calls, her voice carrying both frustration and relief. They had been forced to sell, downsizing into a modest condo, far from the glittering shoreline they once boasted about. My father sold the boat at a painful loss. My mother gave up the timeshare she once flaunted. Their empire of appearances had crumbled brick by brick under the weight of their own choices. Jessica told me something that stunned me. "They're blaming you, Natasha. In front of everyone. They say you abandoned them, that you broke your promise of lifelong support." I had to laugh, though there was no joy in it, just a sharp exhale of disbelief. "Let them talk," I told her. I was done twisting myself into knots to explain the truth. And in time, the truth began to explain itself. Members of our extended family reached out, many apologizing for believing the worst of me at first. Even my father's sister, who had always sided with him, called to say she finally understood. Their story had cracked under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Meanwhile, our life was taking shape in a way I never thought possible. With Diana, the widowed real estate agent I had met through the support group, I found a small, 3-bedroom house in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. The mortgage was lower than the rent I had been paying for my cramped apartment, and for the first time, Ethan and Emily had a backyard to run in. The sound of their laughter echoing against the fence was sweeter than any inheritance my parents could have offered. My side business, designing memorial websites, blossomed. What had started as a single tribute page for James had grown into something deeply meaningful, not just for me, but for the people I helped. Each site was a canvas of grief and love, and in crafting them, I found a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before the accident. Clients came from my support group at first, then from friends of friends, and soon I had more work than I could take on. I scaled back my graphic design contracts and leaned into this work of memory and healing. Olivia remained my steady anchor. She arrived 3 days a week, her calm presence filling the house with warmth. On the days she wasn't there, I adjusted my schedule around the twins, learning that productivity didn't have to mean sacrifice, that being a mother didn't have to mean being less. And Jessica, she surprised me. She began spending weekends with us, cooking dinners, playing with Ethan and Emily, staying long enough that I sometimes caught glimpses of the sisterhood we might have had all along if our parents hadn't twisted us into competitors. For the first time, I felt surrounded by a real community. Neighbors brought casseroles when we moved in. Members of the support group organized playdates. Even Valerie, the nurse who had been with me on that awful night in the hospital, stopped by with her kids, filling the house with easy laughter. I had lost my husband, cut ties with my parents, and yet somehow I was less alone than I had ever been. 6 months after the surgery, a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, from my mother. I nearly threw it away unopened, but curiosity pricked me enough to slit the envelope. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably hers. Inside was something I had never seen before, a real apology. "I've had time to reflect," she wrote. "Watching you build a life without us has forced me to confront truths I didn't want to see. I was jealous of your independence. I resented your resilience. When you asked us to watch the twins, you were reaching out, and we failed you completely. I am deeply sorry." I sat at the table with that letter in my hands, tears dripping onto the ink, blurring the lines. It was not a request for money, not even a plea for forgiveness, just an apology. I didn't know what to do with it. I showed it to Jessica, who was wary. "They've been talking about writing to you for weeks," she said. "Dad was against it at first, but after his heart scare he's changed, at least a little. At least a heart scare, chest pains, high blood pressure. He was on medication now, actually listening to doctors for once. Mortality has a way of humbling even the proudest men." I wasn't ready to answer right away. I needed time. Time to decide if this was real change or just another manipulation wrapped in pretty paper. 1 year after my surgery, I agreed to meet them. Neutral Ground, a small cafe not far from my new home. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. My father looked smaller somehow, his arrogance stripped into something quieter. My mother wore no designer labels, just simple, practical clothes. They sat across from me in silence until my father's shoulders began to shake, tears slid down his face. "I've been a terrible father," he said, his voice breaking. "And an even worse grandfather. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I see it now, how selfish we've been." My mother reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close. "We've been in therapy," she said. "Jessica pushed us into it. At first we resisted, but it's been changing us. I didn't rush to forgive. I didn't rush to wound either. Instead, I showed them pictures of Ethan and Emily, told them stories about our new life. And for once, they listened. They didn't interrupt. They didn't deflect. They just listened." As we stood to leave, my father asked quietly, "Would it be possible, someday, to know our grandchildren. I thought of Ethan's laughter in the backyard, Emily's sleepy smile. I thought of the years of neglect and betrayal, the word burden still carved into me. And then I thought of the woman I had become, no longer desperate for approval, but fierce in my boundaries. That depends, I said. Not on your words, on your actions. If you're truly committed to change, we can start with short supervised visits. But my children will only have relationships with people who respect their mother. Walking out of that cafe, I felt lighter. Not because I trusted them fully, not because I believed everything was fixed, but because I finally knew my worth. I was no longer the daughter begging for scraps of love. I was the mother who would never let her children feel unwanted, unprotected, unseen. And for the first time, that was enough. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment below. I want to hear your own stories of standing up, of choosing yourself, of breaking cycles. Together, our voices can remind someone else they're not alone.